Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You would have noticed that anyone starting off with a lecture has the almost uncontrollable urge to do two things. The first is to say thank you. So let me repeat that, Woody, to you and your team for inviting me. And the second thing is to say welcome to everyone. Thank you, and I hope over the next few minutes you will enjoy the presentation. Woody was the previous presenter, and Woody, I have the sinking feeling that you may have walked off with a pointer. Is that possible? Or are you hiding it somewhere? There we go. Right. We retrieved the pointer. Thank you. So a little bit more about the non-allos this afternoon. That one you've encountered before. When you see that again, it's finished. This presentation will be over. I mentioned yesterday that that this very brief historical introduction will come today. This is the old map of South Africa. It still has 4 provinces, quite deliberately, for the simple reason that it gives a bit of an explanation about the botanical exploration of South Africa, which when the Europeans at least arrived there in 1652, that was the Dutch settlers. In 1652 they arrived at the Cape with the intention, in fact, being a botanical one. But not so much the exploration. The intention was to establish a vegetable garden. And that, of course, was to replenish the ships of the Dutch East Indian Company that went around the Cape on their way to the Orient, where spices, the gold of those days, had to be fetched. So in a way, the fact that Europeans arrived in southern Africa was due to botany. A number of other groups, the French Huguenots and then later the British occupations of South Africa. In fact, the British came in 1795 for the first time. And a couple of years later, they gave it back. They gave the Cape back to the Dutch. And 10 years after that, in 1806, that was the final British occupation of South Africa as we know it today. Between 1806 and roughly 1836, for 30 years, the Dutch, the settlers around the Cape, were reasonably happy with the British occupation, but then they started moving inland for a variety of reasons. And that was known as the so-called Great Trek. Very similar to what happened in the States, of course, with the pioneers going west, moving inland. In 1820, that was about 14 years after the British arrived, they dropped the 1820 British settlers in Algoa Bay, right there. That's Port Elizabeth. This impenetrable thicket where they were told to establish farms, which they did quite successfully. And to this day, this area, there's quite a few British families that remain behind and still farming that area. But the two probably most significant events that led to the opening up of the interior of the country, the one was more or less in that area, the other one there, and the other one there. 3 events, 2 of them linked to the discovery of gold, and the other one the discovery of diamonds. The biggest diamond ever found in the world was just east of Pretoria at a town called Cullinan. Massive diamond. But diamonds in essence around Kimberley led to a very big move inland. And the moment that you find these minerals, valuable minerals, there's a massive movement of people into those areas looking for the wealth. Gold was found on the reef, the Witwatersrand. And that's in fact where the name of the currency of South Africa, the rand, comes from, Witwatersrand. And then also in the east, in Mpumalanga, as we know it today, near Pelgrimsrus and Witrifuur, gold was also found there, but that wasn't really sustainable. Fairly small deposits, and there's very little mining going on, gold mining at least, at this stage. But it really pulled the development into the interior of the country. And this was about 50 years after the Great Trek started, in about late 1880s, 1890s. And of course, once that happened, these were independent republics. That was the old Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek, which is now the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. And needless to say, it was impossible to leave these deposits in the hands of the barbarians. So the British annexed this entire region. And that played a big role in terms of also opening up, railway tracks, wagons moved inland, and it assisted with the exploration not only of minerals and geology, but also the botanical exploration of the region. I showed this slide 6 years ago in San Diego. So those of you who were there will probably remember it. Limpopo, East and Southern Cape buckled under the severe drought last summer. Some high rainfall areas. Demand for water expected to exceed supply by 2013. That was 2 years before that happened. So your next question will be, well, did that actually happen? And in fact, by 2016, water had run out in Pretoria, and there were parts of Pretoria that had what we call water shedding. You run out of electricity, there's electricity shedding, power shedding, and by 2016, parts of Pretoria were shut down for parts of the day. There simply wasn't any water. And I mention this because there's been a tremendous drive, as in many parts of the US, the Southwest, to alert people to the fact that gardens are in fact extremely water hungry, very thirsty. So developing water-wise gardens is now an imperative. And that is happening increasingly. Of course, by 2016, late last year, the dams got filled up within a matter of days with enormous downpours. So at least up north, the drought is alleviated, but Cape Town has run out of water. It's a winter rainfall area. By late summer last year, the water restrictions were incredibly severe, waiting for this replenishment during this winter, which is right now, but it's not rain. So there's quite a few problems in that area. So what is Gauteng? This area where gold was discovered. It's the commercial heart of Africa, of the whole continent, because, of course, of the gold that was discovered there. So it's a critical area, critically important, although it only covers about 1.4% of the land surface of that area. This one is getting boring, I know. It's the map of South Africa, and we'll take a look now, more or less, at the flora in that part of the continent, starting in southern Angola and then moving into the country proper, South Africa. Roughly globally, there's about 10,000 species of succulents, and that includes the cacti. 10,000, and then, we always boast, well, we've got largest diversity. In fact, 47% of the succulents of the world is restricted to that area, about 4,700. When we think of succulents in general, obviously leaf succulents, stem succulents, those are the two that visually we can see very easily. Thick stem or very thick leaves. But there are several other types of succulents, and the one probably more difficult to detect is, of course, root succulents, because they're underground, and some of these roots can be as thick as your arm. but watery, not a woody thing, very, very thick succulent roots. Even strelitzias, for example, the national flower of Los Angeles, which is true, which comes from, in fact, Port Elizabeth. It comes from the Eastern Cape. Has very, very thick. If you've ever tried to dig out a banana plant or a strelitzia, then you'll know how thick those roots can become. Very, very thick and succulent. I mentioned bananas. Why? A few weeks ago, we received copies of this book, which has been in Dave's shop, called Field Guide to Succulents of South Africa. It's hot off the press. We managed to get 3 copies to bring along and just to show to people. It will be available in the States. I think the distributor in the US is called Casemate, and that's where Dave and several other bookshops get their stock. It sells in South Africa for 350 Rand. If you want to know how much that is in dollars, divide by 13. The exchange rate is very favorable from a United States point of view. So it's embarrassingly affordable to visit South Africa, amongst other things. I should mention that. And when we did that book, we deliberately decided to also show some of the related groups. Where do these succulent plant, the genera, the families, where do they fit in? What are some of the relatives? And for each of these families that we covered, and about 80 plant families have succulents. We gave introductory pages that speak a little bit about the relatives. How do they fit together? And also in this presentation, I'll try and do that and hopefully not bore you, to reflect on what are the other plant groups that have a relationship with those that are succulent. And some of them are counterintuitive. Nevertheless, let's get into the Bushveld. The word Bushveld is equivalent to savanna. That's an African name that we apply. I showed a little bit of this. This is savanna, and there again you will see a baobab tree. This is in southern Angola. It's one of the, probably, well, it must be the most photographed pass in Angola, going down. It's called Leba, L-E-B-A, Leba Pass in southern Angola. If you carry on with this very, very good tarred road, you drive up from the plateau right down to the coast, to the beach, the Atlantic Ocean, and literally into the Namib Desert. It's the northern limit of the Namib. So the vegetation changes are quite dramatic, going from a very lush bushveld right into desert, with these fantastic outcrops, rocky outcrops, granite outcrops, and dotted, especially around the pass, with these bush giants, the equivalent of the elephant, these wonderful waxy trunks that one comes across. And as you go down into the desert from this pass, you also find these stunted baobab trees. It's exactly the same species, not a different species. And it's as tall as a grown man. It's about 1 to 2 meters tall, because obviously of the much more arid environment, with these Sansevieria personis in the foreground. These are not young plants. I deliberately showed this. This is in the middle of nowhere. I mean, absolutely in the middle of nowhere. There's not a town, not a farm, nothing around, and yet we come across, can you see that? A Puntia ficus indica, that's what we call it. These plants, the common name is rhinoceros grass, renostergras. Only a rhinoceros will venture into a dense stand of these very, very sharp-tipped leaves of the Sansevieria.
What is the red in the right-hand side?
Brian Campbell, sitting here in front, is still salivating about aloes. And Brian asked, what is that red thing there? That's a new species of aloe. If you were doubting that Brian, that's the short version of that's the short answer. If one takes a closer look at the baobab trees, these small little trees, about this tall, the temptation is to think it's a young plant that's going to grow up one day and be a big one. And here I'm stealing from Woody. Where's Woody?
He's outside.
He is outside. You can tell him that I'm stealing from him. Woody likes lichens. And he would say, when he focuses in on a lichen, he likens lichens. These plants are very, very old, but they remain very short. Staying with the stem succulents for the next few, maybe 10 or so slides, these commiferas in the family Burseraceae, the myrrh family, wonderful thick trunks that develop as one travels down into the more arid environment. Another example in the same area, it's like a study in black and white, but in full color. This is a full color shot, but these black and white trunks all over the place. Sterculia, it has a tremendous distribution range. There's an arid corridor that runs through Africa that linked the flora of the Namib area, Namibia and Angola, right through to the Horn of Africa, to Somalia. And there are still, as one follows through phytogeographic analyses, some of the remnant populations, one would find these cropping up over thousands of kilometers, going up to the northeast.
Has that fallen over, or is it growing?
It's growing. It's stunted, again, as you enter the desert. It's not fallen over. It's a big blob of wax with these little branches sticking out. And that's exactly what it looks like. It didn't, drop down on one side. And right next to that, this thing that looks like a little piglet that lies on its back, it's Cyphostemma uter. With a peeling skin even. Quite remarkable. This is in the dry season, way before the rains arrive. When the rains arrive, of course, they sprout leaves and the leaves start developing. In fact, if you look carefully, they're very, very nice little green buds with the leaves just beginning to emerge. So the stem life form, fat-stemmed life form, very well developed, often in the savannas, in the Bushveld regions. Here's another one with quite a few more branches. And again, it's the growth form, flat on the ground and then with the stems coming up for maybe 2 feet. And here I will, in the next slide or so, digress a little bit in terms of the relations. This genus, Catophractes, the species Catophractes alexandri, again with this very large stem. If you look at the fruit, they look like castanets. In fact, when the wind blows, one can hear the knocking noise. And it's a very close relative of this. In the family Bignoniaceae, the jacaranda tree. Flower shape, very similar. This is the jacaranda. How common is the white jacaranda in this? No. There's a pure white form of jacaranda trees, and quite honestly, just before midsummer, in the early summer, it's a most spectacular sight with these coming into flower. Another close relative is one of the worst weeds ever, cat's claw. And it must be the most unwanted caudiciform one could possibly ever get in your garden. They form very thick taproots that can be exposed and grown above ground, making a nice little caudiciform succulent. But it's a terrible weed. And these will smother forests very, very easily. In South Africa, very, very difficult to get rid of. And chemical treatment is virtually all that helps for it. And another one, Tacoma stans, also a very bad weed, forms a small tree. So one has this almost anomaly with these fantastic Catophractes plants, thick-stemmed ones, and many of the close relatives became terrible pests. Even the jacaranda tree, in the more subtropical parts of South Africa, you are not allowed to plant it. It's a weed. It's a terrible weed. Going back to the Namibia and Angolan side, the Euphorbia eduardoi, very tall, sometimes without a single branch at the top, long, long, thin stem when you focus upwards, with mostly the little cluster of stems right at the top. Staying with the euphorbias, again, still in that same area, going down into the desert, Euphorbia verosa, and parts of that very reminiscent in terms of the structure of the vegetation to what one would find around Tucson, for example, with the exception yet again that what you would see here would be replaced, not a palo verde, but sudworm, sweet thorn, acacia trees, and of course not a cactus in sight in southern Africa. But otherwise, very similar undulating hillocks, koppies, where, at least in terms of structure, the vegetation very similar. This is now entering the Namib Desert, and if you look carefully, can you see that little outcrop there of housing? That's the sort of right on the limits of a town called Namib. It's a coastal town right on the coast. Just beyond that town is the Atlantic Ocean, very arid part. That's the Namib Desert that you see at the back there, with the euphorbias here in the foreground. And where that town is situated, you will find the Welwitschia. Welwitschia is nowadays recognized as consisting of two subspecies, the one from Namibia and the other one from just across the river in Angola. And this one is the typical one of Welwitschia. Two leaves it forms in its entire life, and those two leaves just carry on growing. And as the wind would sweep them and rip them apart, it creates the impression of being more than two leaves. But in essence, there's one on this side and there's one on that side, with these very prominent woody trunks, with the flowers just developing. And then, of course, around that town, quite a bit of agriculture. It's not a big town, with sugar, maize being grown right there, and again, inevitably, the quintias, which in southern Africa is a delicacy, especially the spineless form is cultivated, and the fruits sold as cactus pears, not as prickly pears. The prickly pear is a declared invasive weed, whereas the spineless one is in fact regarded as the pest plant, may prove to be the best plant. And I'll focus in on that little bit of text there, and if you can read that. The spineless cactus is one of South Africa's three most important drought-resistant fodder crops, the other two being the old man saltbush and the American aloe. That's Agave americana. The saltbush is the salsola. It's an indigenous one. But the other two drought-resistant crops is in fact the spineless cactus and Agave americana. Agave americana leaves, those long blue leaves, are cut off, and then the spines on the margins are ripped off with a panga, we call them, a long knife. A small cut is made on each side, and given that it's so fibrous, one can rip them off with one strong pull, and the leaf is then cut into sections about 6 inches long, and that's fed to cattle. It doesn't have very high protein content, but the cattle pick it up. In fact, if you put out fodder for cattle, when they get fed, they will walk straight to the agaves, eat that first, and then go to the rest of the fodder. Let's move away from the western side of the subcontinent, but sticking to the stem succulents. Adenia multiflorum, very well known, obviously, and very widely cultivated. Adenium swazicum, again with these fantastic stems and shapes growing amongst boulders. But again, to try and put this into context, this is one of the most anomalous families, really unimaginable. This is a terrible weed, another one that invades South Africa from South American. I think this was originally, if I'm not mistaken, Arauia cericifera, we call it. And here it's growing around that stem there. That's a branch of Celtis africana, the white stinkwood. This you grow in the gardens in Arizona, Nerium oleander. This was taken in the Mediterranean. This is natural habitat. Fantastic plants. This was the first one that really became a big pest in South Africa, going back several decades. The oleander was the first one that triggered. Now you must remember that today the budget for removing alien invasives in South Africa outstrips the budget for any biodiversity work on indigenous plants by several factors, by hundreds of millions of rands, to try and get rid of plants that should never have been there. So the legislation is becoming far more proactive to prevent spread and to eradicate. But it's hundreds of millions of rands more spent on removing these than on studying the indigenous flora. That's the sad development. Of course, wonderful flowers that one can find on these neriums, and in the same family, the frangipani, plumeria, which has fantastically fragrant flowers, and in the same family, those that stink to high heavens. This is Stapelia leonardii, with I mean, it's an unbelievable stench. When you walk into the field, one can smell them very distinctly. And then the pachypodiums, of course, apart from those in Madagascar, in southern Africa, quite spectacular plants. This is the half mens, which always grows with the tip pointing to the north. And from a distance, it in fact looks like a human moving in a northerly direction. Talking about the agaves, this is the other, the second most important dry crop fodder plant. And I'm going to deviate a little bit and talk about the systematics, because this is our currency. We talk about names of plants, that's how we communicate. When Kubitsky was published, the big treatment of the vascular plant genera of the world, Kubitsky was based in Hamburg in Germany, and he initiated this project, which covered all the families in quite extensive detail. This was more or less what was accepted. When the Illustrated Handbook of Succulent Plants appeared, this was the arrangement that was favored by Joachim Tiede. And then the family concepts changed. The so-called APG came about, the Angiosperm phylogeny group. This reflects the third version. There is a fourth version out, which now took the Agavaceae and included it in the Asparagaceae, moving from an 8 genus family to a 153 genus family, with the agaves included about 23 genera in that subfamily. So one would imagine that since 1753, a certain level of stability would have been established as far as the systematics, the taxonomy is concerned. Sadly, that's not the case, quite remarkably. Amongst other things, because of the advent of molecular techniques, new insights being gained. Names of things change for two reasons, one of two reasons. Either because of new relationships being discovered, or because there's an older name being dug out. In other words, a nomenclatural reason. And they're actually both quite destructive when it gets to the systematics. So the agaves now cluster with this. Now, this is Asparagus acutifolius. It's a picture that Estrella, who's in the audience, took. And with Ruscus, you can see this leaf that bears a fruit. Of course, it's not a leaf. It's exactly the same structure that you will find in a cactus, a cladote. So it's a branch that will have a little flower there. The branch just looks like a leaf, and there's the fruit. It's one of those classical examples that the first-year botany student will be shown in a practical exam. This liquor was produced for about 10 years, roughly 10 years, in South Africa based on Agave americana. It's a tequila-like drink. It's no longer available. The industry folded because the industry was linked very closely to the individual who ran it, and unfortunately he passed away and the industry collapsed. Agave cisalana is still used for the extraction of fibers, and one can buy these little dusters, which is here tied with a piece of inner tube of a motor car tire. And these are still produced. This is pure agave cisalana fiber. Talking about systematics, this is probably the most common bulb in the Mediterranean Europe. It has any one of these possible names, none of which is in fact valid. So this bulb doesn't have a name. Can you imagine? The most common bulb in the Mediterranean Europe, this is obviously in the season when it flowers. It looks like this. That's the underground part. This is the inflorescence. And it doesn't have a name. It's a bit of almost an accusation against taxonomists that we've reached a point where, because of these changes, certain names become invalid. You can't use them because of how we typify the names. Remember, a name is linked to a type. It's linked to a specimen, not a living one, a preserved specimen. So that's a long story. Sticking a little bit to the bulbs, back into Southern Africa. This little bulb it's an epigeel bulb. It's about the size of the half of the digit of the little finger of a grown person. It grows amongst the pebbles, and it's obviously green, and it photosynthesizes. There are no leaves. It grows above ground. Very typical succulent growth form that one finds in Southern Africa. Those are the little flowers. It's this network, looks like a cobweb almost, with these tiny little flowers right at the tips. Still on the name changes, these bulbs also grow above ground, pregnant onions. It used to be Ornithogalum longibracteatum, now it's Stellarioides longibracteata. And this is what the inflorescences look like. Very common in the Southern Cape. Boaphene diastica also grows above ground very often, with the stem, in inverted commas, the top part of the bulb exposed above ground, with the inflorescences, especially when they dry, very characteristic. The whole structure will be loosened by wind and will roll, and so like a tumbleweed, and disperse the seeds that develop in the fruit. Moving away a little bit from the stem succulents, looking at the Crassulaceae. I mean, some of these are absolutely spectacular in terms of color, but are highly variable species, with smooth leaves, blue leaves, white leaves, green leaves, light green leaves, felty leaves, in fact, sticky leaves, but always with a bulbous swelling. And that's one of the ways in which one can distinguish it from some of the other cotyledon species. The concept of hybridization between species within a genus, even among genera, was discussed several times over the last few days. It happens extensively. It's a known mechanism of speciation in ancient times and in present times. It happens all the time. This is an example of a hybrid. This is the hybrid in flower there, and if you look down, there's the hybrid. This is one of the parents. So that's Campanulata, is the yellow one here, and that's the other parent. And this is Campanulata again, that provided some of the genes. Looking very similar to the variety Dactylopsis of Abiculata. However, this one is massively distinguished in terms of distribution range. This is a northern species. And throughout, this is Senecio, name is gone, it'll come back now. So one often encounters these miniature succulent gardens wherever one goes, and this is in the center of the country, in what in essence is grassland, on these rocky outcrops, where one encounters them. Still sticking to these, No basal swelling there, but the center part of the perianth is enlarged. So you will note the bulge in the middle, and that's the variety oblonga of orbiculata. And then, of course, orbiculata itself, this is the Western Cape one, the typical one. If you're interested in succulents, it's one of the first you will see when you fly into Cape Town, when you get into the natural habitat. It's amazing how some of the misconceptions persist around species identification. This is a Crassula. It was originally described as a cotyledon, going back to 1668, because the darn thing wouldn't flower. And John Miller, who described it in those years, thought it was a cotyledon. Only several years later did it flower, and they realized it's Crassula. Of course it's a Crassula. So this is Crassula arborescens. And to this day, it's confused with Crassula ovata. And in the natural habitat, when one sees them, one will appreciate why the confusion still exists. This subspecies was described in Crassula arborescens, and it's the one with the undulate leaves. Every single leaf is wavy, so it was taken out as a subspecies. The flowers can range from pure white to pink infused in both species, both ovata as well as arborescens, or they can be pure white. And for many years, flower color was used to distinguish them, and it does not work remotely. In terms of phytogeography, the distribution ranges of plants, quite interesting. Often in the Crassulaceae, some have enormous distribution ranges that will stretch over thousands of kilometers, coming down the west coast through the winter rainfall area into the southern Cape, beyond through the eastern Cape, and it's in exactly the same taxon, with exactly the same floral morphology, with no variation detectable, this being Crassula cotyledonus. Another example of such a vast distribution range is Crassula expansa, small little shrublet. You can fit it into your hand with either the reddish leaves, green leaves, but unmistakable throughout. Crassula hemispherica, this is in the Klein Karoo, in the Little Karoo around Karlitsdorp, with spectacular flat leaves, often when grown exposed turning pink, and then of course a very common, I think, in cultivation in many parts of the world, Crassula perfoliata. And the spectacular part is when it's in flower. I mean, this fantastic bright red flower. Crassula subaphylla, variety subaphylla, it's probably the genus that was the best treated for the flora of Southern African series by a gentleman called Helmut Tulke. Helmut did the genus Crassula for his PhD at the University of Cape Town several years ago in the late 70s. Helmut eventually emigrated. He left for Australia, though he's no longer in South Africa. And he recognized 150 species in the genus Crassula. 150 species means that he had to assess well over 700 names. And that's the challenge. You know, what is a synonym of what? So it's not for the faint of heart. And his PhD treatment eventually became the basis of the flora of Southern African treatment, which I'm sure many of you will have. This, of course, if the moment that you do something for an academic treatment, you need to finish the darned work and hopefully one day return and fix everything that you messed up when you did your PhD. And in Crassula, there's quite a lot of untangling that still needs to be done in terms of the species complexes that Helmut, and I'm not criticizing him at all. I mean, it was a fantastic piece of work that he produced for both his academic work and for his flora treatment. Crassula subaphylla, again, very wide distribution range and very typical, these small clusters of flowers. Now, regularly, some of these are being reassessed, these little groups of species that he recognized. Mark Mort from, help me, where's Mark based?
Kansas.
Kansas. Kansas University. Mark has been very active on working on, at this stage, the molecular systematics of Crassulaceae. Crassula swaziensis is one of those that don't stick to the margins of the subcontinent. It moves up into Zimbabwe, where there are subspecies recognized. Subspecies, it's a bit of an irritation, isn't it? If you know, and varieties for that matter. Sometimes I think if it differs, call it a species. Can you imagine how much easier it will make things for databases? These international databases of plant names, which they have to deal with hundreds of thousands of them. So, you know, I mean, I'm a bit naughty when I say that. It's not really true. But, you know, maybe we should make a law and just do away with subspecies. If it differs, call it a species. Get it over with. And then just, you know, the Crassulaceae is not restricted, obviously. It's one of the most widespread ones. This is Umbilicus rupestris, which also has a very wide distribution range in Mediterranean Europe. And some of them can be beautiful with these shortly stalked flowers. Looks like little umbrellas. And this one turning purple. And on the roofs in Portugal, this one is found, Sedum album. Sedum again is one of those genera that just jump the continents, growing on the roofs, like here also. Another name, this is not South African, it's Oriental, the genus Orostachus, you familiar with? Yeah? It's about to change, unless the name is conserved, because there's a problem with the splitting up of Hyloteliphian. So there is a proposal to have Orostachus conserved, which will serve within the next 6 years before the General Committee of the International Nomenclature Bureau. And then that's the story, unfortunately, of the lives of taxonomists. And still within the Crassulaceae, Kalanchoe, I mean, a terrible weed. It's invaded parts of the country, especially the subtropical parts. It's a terrible weed in Australia. It's one of the few areas where South Africa and Australia collaborates. We hate the Australians. They hate us, you know. I'm kidding, of course, it's a sport thing, you know, the rugby matches and so on. But interestingly, in South Africa, the genus Kalanchoe has similarly been neglected. And Estrella Figueiredo and a couple of us have started untangling Kalanchoe in Southern Africa now. And, you know, what used to be a 13 species genus in the subcontinent, it's about 150 species worldwide, has already increased to 17. So the reality is, whatever you start with, looking at it fresh, you will find there's a lot of work to be done, even though the previous treatment was about 30 years ago. So you know, nothing remains stable. One of the groups that really need attention, again, is in the Anacampsorotaceae, used to be part of the Portulacaceae. There's a lot that needs to be taxonomically unraveled. Filamentosa, which can be very easily confused with several other species. There's the name that slipped my mind earlier, Senecio radicans. There is it again. It's very widespread, a daisy. But in this instance, Anacampsaros rufescens, just note it's purple, the undersides of the leaves usually. That's what it looks like. And when it gets to Telephastrum, the leaves always green, same color on both sides. Within the Portulacaceae, which is a relative of Anacampsorotaceae, that's probably the most misunderstood genus at the moment in the country. This is Oleraceae, it's the edible one, and this is what's widely called quadrifida. It's not really grown in gardens at all, but more than likely when one starts doing this analysis properly, you'll dig up 4 or 5 species currently just being called Portulaca quadrifida. It's a dumping ground for things that we can't identify. And of course the speckworm, Portulacaria afra, that makes those beautiful bonsais, which it doesn't flower in cultivation. You're very lucky if you get it to flower. In habitat it flowers every year regularly, no problem. In cultivation it's very reluctant to flower. This is the white form. And amazingly, if you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals, count again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if you read textbooks, it will say petals 4, sepals 4, and yet it should be 5. I'll begin to wrap up. I'm almost there. I've got the red light blinking at me. This is Pelargonium peltatum. It's one of the parents of all the magnificent pelargoniums grown in continental Europe. The cultivars that were developed in Germany, in Austria, and in several of the northern countries. Those cultivars look terrible in South Africa. They were selected for the northern climates. If South Africa had 1 cent for every pelargonium grown in the world, 1 cent from our material, we would not need the gold mining industry. And I'm serious. And of course there are many succulents. In the tetragonum, for example, is largely leafless. That's it. It's only got those stems. With that, I'll wrap up, and I think I've stayed within my time limit. Thank you very much, ladies.